Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining. Now that Michael introduced us, we'll get started. So we've got quite a bit of information to cover today. We only have 55 minutes in which to do it, so we'll try to go fast so we get through everything. We'll plan for questions at the end, but if we don't get to anything, you can feel free to email or call either one of us with any questions that we don't get to. So let's start way back at the beginning. As most of you are probably aware, ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. As I'm sure you've seen, this is a hot topic for companies right now beyond just compensation. Companies are striving to innovate and push ESG initiatives more than ever. And companies are showing that commitment to ESG goals by increasingly tying compensation to ESG performance metrics. I've heard some refer to this as paying well by paying for good, which I think is a really good way to put it. Today, we'll talk about how things are trending on that front, first by starting with ESG performance metrics. Okay, of course, as I just mentioned, ESG is broader than just compensation. ESG goals frequently permeate many aspects of a company's decision-making, from business decisions to recruiting decisions and so much more. In particular, various aspects of human capital are impacted by ESG, as shown on this slide. Human capital is the intangible asset or quality comprised of a person's knowledge, skill, education, values that person develops over time. As a result, this isn't something that you'll see on a company's balance sheet, but it is vital to a company's success. Greater investment in employees leads to enhanced human capital and greater productivity and success. On this slide, you'll see a few aspects of human capital that are impacted by ESG. For example, rewards, that could relate to compensation, recruiting, recruiting, that could be diversity and gender initiatives, retention could be pay equity initiatives, and regulation complying with government ESG mandates. These are just a few examples out of many that would fall under any of these umbrellas. Ultimately, companies are focusing on how investment in ESG-related matters can help them not only function effectively, but thrive sustainably. On the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the dual nature of ESG initiatives. One way to put this is ESG can be used as a sword or a shield. In other words, it can be used on offense or defense. On offense, it can create a proactive opportunity for positive results, or used on defense where it results in protection against potential negative items. There's a multitude of benefits to investing in ESG, and we believe that for this reason, companies are looking to compensation as a way to drive ESG results. For example, on offense, ESG might lead to enhanced valuation multiples, greater customer loyalty, improvements to recruiting and retention, or reputational benefits. On the other hand, on defense, ESG might protect against unfavorable say-on-pay votes or director votes, reputational or media hits, or employee attrition and morale issues. ESG initiatives are important to a wide variety of people, and so there are countless benefits on both sides of the coin. And with that, I'll turn it over to Allison.
Great, thanks, Dario. So we thought we'd start with this saying here about what gets measured gets managed, right? I think we've all heard that, but really in this area, it's become what gets measured and really built into your corporate goals, KPIs. That's really what gets managed when you then tie it to your near-term and long-term compensation. People really focus on that once there's a direct tie to what it means to them personally, right? And I think we've seen that a lot with kind of your more traditional financial and operational performance metrics and how those have been incorporated into incentive programs. And it really motivates people to really make progress in those specific areas. So we're really starting to see that now with ESG, given such a hot topic and everything. Although companies' approach to this is much more nuanced, kind of given the new nature and the fact that it is different from financial and operational performance metrics. So we're going to really get into how to think about this given kind of the unique situation with ESG. There it goes. So how we thought we would kind of structure today's kind of content is kind of focused around these 6 questions: the who, what, when, where, why, and how, to really tie compensation to these ESG metrics and really initiatives to make progress on these important goals that companies have set out to do. So starting with the who, as in who is actually paying attention to this? Who are the various stakeholders that are weighing in on when and how you should be doing these type of efforts? And then also, like, who should this apply to? Is this one of those things that we should kind of keep at the top of the house for just kind of executives? Or is this something that should kind of flow throughout your whole employee ranks in terms of tying people's compensation to these ESG efforts? What? What, as in, what type of metrics are appropriate for your company? What should we really be using here to determine if we are succeeding in these various areas? When? When as in, when is a company really ready to actually tie compensation to ESG efforts? So they have the tools and resources that they need behind the scenes to really be sure that they're measuring things properly. And also, when should ESG performance be measured? And that varies a lot depending on the specific metric as well. Where, as in where should the ESG metric really be incorporated into your compensation program? Is that something that should be in your annual incentive plan? Should it be in your long-term incentive plan? Should it be in both? There's a lot of different options there. And then why? As in why should we even do this in the first place, right? Why does this matter? How does this tie to our long-term strategic goals as a company? Is that really what's motivating this? Or is it because we have shareholders that are asking and really wanting to see progress in these areas? And then finally, how? So as in how are we actually going to measure whether we're succeeding in these ESG efforts? Is it going to be qualitative? Is it going to be quantitative? How are we actually going to score our ESG progress in these areas and if we're actually making progress on that? So we're going to go through each of these questions in detail here, but we're going to go a little bit of different order. And we thought we'd start with the why, since we think that's a really important question to kick us off. So with that, Dario?
Yep. Thanks, Allison. Okay, so yeah, let's start digging into some of these questions. Let's start with why. Why ESG performance metrics? Well, for starters, look at the box on the right side of the screen. It's ISS survey results from 2021. 86% of investors at ISS surveyed and 73% of non-investors thought that non-financial ESG metrics were an appropriate measure to incentivize executives. That's a really high percentage, probably higher than I expected. Why is ESG such a hot topic right now? Why are investors and non-investors so interested in this? Well, I think over the last few years, there's been a few things like the pandemic, social justice and equality movements, international conflicts that have really brought a number of ESG issues to the forefront. Safety, diversity, inclusion, pay equity, climate change, those are all ESG-related matters that have always been here, but I feel like there's been a renewed and heightened focus on those things from the general public, advisory firms, activists, employees, customers, regulators. All of those different parties are watching for ESG. And one of the ways that companies show commitment to that is by tying ESG performance metrics to their ESG goals. While I think that ESG initiatives are great, they are not the easiest to implement, measure, or judge. They're often amorphous or vague. They can impact financial results negatively in some situations. Hence, there's a challenge with ensuring that ESG metrics are properly aligned with company goals and business performance. So who's watching? Who's watching for ESG? We just named some of the parties. Let's dive into some specific quotes that are recent or recent actions or changes that have been made. So first, Alliance Global Investors on February 21st, 2023, they announced that for large cap European companies that fail to integrate ESG performance metrics into their executive pay policies, they would vote against any directors that are up for election. That's a pretty big step, I feel like, and although it's limited to large cap European companies, it's not hard to imagine more and more investment firms and ISS and Glass Lewis following this approach in future years. Speaking of ISS, they have two different ESG ratings in their proxy reports. And you may have seen them if you're a public company. They place them very prominently at the beginning of the report. So we've got an ISS governance quality score, and then we've got an ISS environmental and social disclosure quality score. And both of those measure different things, but included under each of them is a look at compensation, in particular ESG-related compensation. Finally, we've got the SEC. The SEC has been looking at this. As some of you may know, the pay versus performance rule recently went into effect for this proxy season, for better or for worse. And the SEC in that final rule mentioned ESG as a growing practice. And there were specific comments that they decided to include in the final rule that pushed for the inclusion of ESG metrics in the tabular list of most important measures used by a company to determine compensation. The SEC ultimately decided against mandating that, but it seems like the writing's on the wall. This is something they're interested in. They did include those comments, and some of the commenters felt like if financial metrics, which is what that pay versus performance table is really focused on, don't tell the whole story, they want to get those ESG metrics in there. And there's nothing prohibiting you from putting those in there if you so choose. But I think a lot of commenters were looking for the SEC to sort of require that and sort of level the playing field where everybody would have to talk about whether they include ESG or not. And with that, I'll kick it back to Allison.
Great. So when is a company ready to measure ESG? Obviously, as we said, everybody's hearing about this, right? It's a very popular, trending topic right now. And I always kind of in the back of my head have my mom's voice saying to me in the back of my head, like, okay, if all your friends jumped off a bridge, would you do it too, right? In terms of just because it's a popular thing to do, that doesn't necessarily mean it's exactly right for your company, or the way they did it is exactly right for your company as well, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all whenever approaching ESG and tying it to compensation. It really has to be done the right way for your specific circumstances. And there's also huge differences across industry, right? If I compare, just for example, a software company versus maybe an oil field services company, right? ESG is going to look very different across those two types of companies, but even within the same industry. So if we stick with energy, a clean energy company versus maybe one of like the conglomerates that's, integrated throughout, that's going to look really different. And how they design their programs and kind of the life stage of that company is really going to impact how they approach ESG. So here's just some of the questions to think about as you approach this, to figure out, when and how to really kind of go about this. But, what goals is the company really looking to achieve? The thing we always highlight here is what's really material to the company in terms of performance, what will actually translate to additional value to shareholders here. And the other one we also, I'll just kind of point out here too, is whenever you start going down this road, being sure that you have the tools and resources behind you to really be able to administer this and it to be, effective and realistic. So, for example, being sure that you don't pick a metric and then realize that you don't have the adequate reporting or data collection processes already in place to then even measure and track how well you're doing relative to that metric. So again, we're advising on this kind of transition, but being sure you build in enough time on the front end as you're going down this road to get the tools you need to actually be successful once this is implemented. So the next slide we have here is showing just the trend in ESG and how much it has really taken off. So the chart here on the left actually shows the prevalence of ESG searches in Google from 2019 to 2023. So you can see how much it's really increased in popularity over the last 5 years. But really, this goes back well before 2019 and the term ESG. This really started with social responsibility concepts back in the 1980s, and that sort of evolved into sustainability kind of in the late 90s. But even still, ESG has expanded just so much in the last 5 years, given a lot of things that has gone on in our country and around the world, that's really kind of shined a spotlight on these areas. And historically, there's been so much focus on maybe components that rolled up into the E, or components that rolled up into the G. But in particular, in the last several years, we've seen a huge emphasis also on the S, the social components, and how the importance of those types of initiatives. So it's no longer nice to have. This is really becoming so ingrained and expected from various stakeholders to a company that it's really seen by many as a really fiduciary duty for the executives and the board to really be making strides in these various areas.
Okay, so companies utilize ESG metrics in different ways. We've got qualitative as well as quantitative. So quantitative data refers to any information that can be measured, quantified, or counted and given a numerical value. Qualitative data is descriptive in nature, expressed in terms of language rather than numbers. Initially, when a company first decides to start using ESG metrics, we frequently find that they go with qualitative measures. The idea being that it allows them a little more subjectivity and gives them something that they can figure out how they want to use over time before they shift into a quantitative metric. As companies get more experienced and are better able to figure out what ESG goals are important, how to measure those goals, and how to gather data, they start to shift more towards the quantitative goals, and there's also a push by investors and other parties to see companies, really go with those concrete numerical-based goals. Okay, so that's the general background, just kind of explaining ESG in general and some of the questions that you should be asking. Now we're going to dive into some market statistics that we gathered for today. We surveyed all 30 members of the Dow Jones, which many of you know is an industrial index of these 30 companies on this slide. In the survey, we looked at a variety of things that we'll cover over the next few slides, but all of them related to ESG compensation practices. We thought that by looking at the Dow Jones, that would provide a fair amount of industry diversity as well as sophistication when it comes to ESG metrics.
Great. So starting off on who is utilizing the ESG metrics. So out of the Dow 30, 25 of them already have some form of ESG metrics in their compensation programs. So it's 83% of those companies. And then when we dive into where are they actually incorporating those metrics, you can see by and large, it's mostly being incorporated into their annual incentive plans. So 73% have them only in their annual incentive plans. However, there's 10% that actually include them both in the annual incentive plan as well as the LTIP, their long-term incentive plan. We didn't see any companies that had it only in their long-term incentive plan, but again, several that used it in both annual and long-term incentive plans. So the other thing we just want to point out here is that this is something that I think we saw companies start off with kind of their short-term incentive plans just so they could show that they're really focusing on making progress in these areas very quickly, right? And so they wanted to put in the annual incentive plan to really show that they're focusing on this. But as we've seen a few more companies incorporate it into their long-term incentive plans, we think that might actually continue. Because if you think about some of the metrics that people are using and really the initiatives behind those metrics, right? So for example, environmental. A lot of the strides and progress we need to make in those areas, that's not something that happens in 1 year, right? It's going to be multiple year, initiatives that to actually move the needle on those goals. And so those actually might fit better in their long-term incentive plan, right? So we think there might be more progress to that as this kind of matures as a metric. I think in the short term, it's just been kind of hard for companies to maybe project out that far. They don't have the tools or the data collection quite yet, but we're seeing companies really work and focus on that where they can kind of look further down in the future and figure out what would be a challenging but still achievable goal around these ESG metrics.
Okay, so what type of ESG metrics should be used? The survey data shows that there's a pretty good mix of different metrics that companies are using. Let's go through all of them. So environmental would be things like reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, carbon emissions, land protection, water use, just to name a few. Social metrics include things like diversity initiatives, health and safety records, and governance includes risk management and compliance initiatives, among many others. As you'll see, social was overwhelmingly used by all 30 of the Dow Jones Index. In addition, environmental, 60% was a high number, and then governance and broad ESG were also used. This seems like a very good mix, considering it's only 30 companies. I think it shows that there's a lot of variety and diversity in terms of the ESG metrics that companies are using. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. Practice varies across the map. Next, how do you measure ESG performance? So again, kind of going back to the quantitative versus qualitative, we've got objective versus subjective goals. So how are companies measuring ESG performance? Objectively, that would be something like specific emissions reduction targets that must be hit over a given year to earn a specific amount of compensation, or is it subjective? For example, the board or comp committee will evaluate an executive's efforts with respect to diversity initiatives. You can see the difference in how certain types of ESG metrics are measured on this slide. So environmental is almost exclusively objective. And I think that makes sense. That's what companies are looking to do, is reduce greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. And so they want an objective goal, and they figured out ways in which to measure that, so it's easier to tie it to numerical data. But there is still a small percentage, 6%, using a subjective measure for that. Then we go to social, and it's really more of the same story, but a little more split. So social, we've got 93% using objective measures, 63% using subjective. Then we go to governance, and it's completely flipped the other way. So 89% of the surveyed companies use governance measures in a subjective way, while only 33% use it in an objective way. And then finally, we've got broad ESG, 83% objective to 17% subjective.
Great. So how do you apply an ESG performance goal? There's a handful of different approaches that companies take. We kind of bucket the various approaches. So the first being a weighted metric. So this is where a certain percentage of, say, an annual incentive plan is directly tied to an ESG metric. So for example, maybe they put 10% on a carbon footprint. I think in practice we see a weighting of between 10 and 25% is oftentimes what we see for ESG metrics. Another approach is a scorecard. So this could be where there's a handful of different ESG efforts that the company wants to measure, and they'll use a scorecard to kind of determine how well they did, and there's an amount just kind of allocated to that scorecard. So for example, 30% based on ESG, and it could also include other types of strategic initiatives. That's pretty common with the scorecard approach, where ESG may just be one of the things that's included in that scorecard. Third, a modifier. So this is often where the board or compensation committee, is applicable, is then allowed to kind of modify the bonus amounts based on a modifier for ESG. So if they had earned, say, a target for based on financial and operational goals, but then they did really great on, say, it was a diversity modifier, then maybe the bonus could go up an additional 10%, if you will, and inversely as well, where it could go down if they did not strive and hit those specific metrics. And then finally, individual. So this could be part of just a discretionary evaluation of performance on an individual by individual basis. It can also be just kind of wrapped into broader individual performance in terms of like a ranking system, if you will. We see all four of these, and we actually see a blend of some of these. There's a lot of companies, and we'll go through some examples here in a second, that kind of use several of these approaches to determine whether performance has been hit in these areas. So now we're going to shift into some recent examples. We thought this would be helpful to kind of give real live examples of companies that have already incorporated ESG into their incentives, and also how they've gone about it from a disclosure perspective. So we're going to start off with Cisco here. So you could see this is, they use ESG metrics in their annual bonus plan. And this first slide really kind of shows where they were focusing on in terms of ESG performance. They have discussion around the specific goals to sustainability, such as greenhouse gas emissions reduction, as well as net zero goals. But then they also have a whole section here on inclusion and individual ESG action plans. So this is more a little bit of the narrative. And then if we go to the next slide here, this is where you could see a little bit more of the numbers and how they went about actually calculating compensation amounts. So this is an example where ESG had a very specific weighting. In this example, it was 20%. But then in some ways, they kind of incorporated a little bit of a scorecard approach within that ESG portion, because they identified several different aspects of ESG that they really wanted to focus on. And then the way they went about determining performance on that is the board really had discretion to determine, based on the executive leadership team's joint execution of their ESG strategy, how well they did. And that is how they determined how that 20% weighting to ESG was actually done in performance. So this is a very subjective determination, right, in terms of how successful they were from an ESG metric. But the board kept that discretion, and then that was what was applied on top of that for that 20% ESG factor.
Okay, next up is Boeing. So Boeing, like Cisco, integrates ESG into its annual incentive plan or cash bonus plan. Hopefully you can see, but the second column there is a company performance score, and that consists of a financial performance score, and that's measuring just typical financial metrics of the company. And then at the bottom, there's the operational performance score, and that actually consists of entirely ESG metrics, and we'll dive into that on the next page. So to calculate somebody's bonus and the amount that they earn, you take their overall company performance score, sort of comprised of those financial measures as well as the ESG measures, multiply that by the individual performance score, and you get their final payout amount capped at 200% of target. So next slide. So here are the different measures in that operational performance score that I just mentioned. So we've got 5 different metrics, and they're all ESG related. So this is a great example of very specific, detailed goals on the E and the S side of ESG. Everything from safety on 2 lines, product safety and employee safety, as well as diversity and inclusion measures. While this is part of a broader scorecard that we just went over, you can see that each specific ESG metric is weighted at 20%. So it's sort of a blend, like Allison just mentioned, of 2 different approaches. We've got the weighted metric as well as the scorecard. You'll also see, hopefully you can read it, there are very specific, objective, quantifiable measures. So specific reductions in incident rates, reducing energy consumption by a specific percentage. Boeing also provides what I think is really good disclosure on not only what the targets were, but also what the outcome was. You'll see a lot of times there's not great disclosure around either one of those. So they may just kind of generally talk about what the ESG goal was, but not give you specific numbers, even where it's an objective, standard. And then as far as performance goes, they may just tell you what the performance, payout ended up being without telling you what the ESG goals were. Boeing actually provides really detailed disclosure on both of those factors. So if you look at their results, you'll see we've got those 5 factors, 20% each. They achieved 3 of them. They didn't achieve 2 of them, so the executive ended up getting 60% on this operational performance score.
Great. So the next one we have here is IBM. And this is an example where they used a modifier. So kind of the underlying maybe target goals was really weighted evenly between revenue and operating cash flow, so kind of normal financial metrics that are very common. But then they added on top of that a diversity modifier. And essentially the way they have it structured is they could go up 5 points, they could stay the same, or they could go down 5 points depending on their performance related to improving the diversity within their workforce. In particular, for 2022, the modifier was based on improvement of representation of executive women on a global basis. And then they also had, specifically for the United States, increased representation in their executive ranks for Black and Hispanic executives. And so, next slide here, you could see how this kind of worked out for them in terms of the performance for revenue and cash flow, and that resulted in an incentive score of 116%. And then the way they set their modifier for diversity is, the status quo was not good enough, right? To get to the 5 extra points, it had to be even more than, a better than what it was before. So even though they increased and made progress in these various areas, as you can see, they ended up still having a modifier of just 0 because they didn't get as far along the road as the board of the compensation committee had wanted in those areas. And so ultimately the goal just ended up staying the same, so there was no up or down on that. But in theory, that could have been a kind of a multiplier effect or discount on the bonus depending on actual performance with that diversity modifier. I will say just on this one, not specifically for IBM, but this is another one we see a lot with safety. Sometimes the modifier approach is good in some of the kind of industrial type companies where they don't necessarily, they kind of think that safety should be just a top priority regardless when you're dealing with people's health and safety, but that they also want to kind of reward with the modifier at the end if they have a very strong year from safety perspective.
Okay, so for the final example, we're going to talk about Dow, who is one of those companies that actually utilizes ESG in its long-term equity awards as well as its annual cash bonus program. So first off is their performance share program, which is their equity awards. So you'll see that those are based 80% on financial metrics, and it's some of the typical ones like operating return on capital, cumulative cash from operators, as well as relative TSR. And so that comprises the first 80% of the bonus, or of the performance shares. And then the remaining 20% is based solely on carbon emissions reduction metrics. And they give a little detail down there at the bottom, but I'll move to the next slide where they provide a lot more detail. So there were three components in that 20% carbon metric. So the first one was to establish emissions reduction plans for scopes 1 and 2 by the end of 2022. And they note that this metric was achieved. And so again, this kind of goes back to what I mentioned with Boeing. Boeing provided really good detailed disclosure. On the other hand, Dow doesn't really say a whole lot. They don't tell you what those reduction plans were. They don't tell you, how much they were achieved by. They really give you, no detail on this. And so then we go to the next, component, define scope 3 carbon emission exposures by year end 2023. They don't really provide any detail here on whether that one was achieved or not. And then finally, third, achieve the scope 1 and 2 reduction targets for a 3-year performance period as compared with the 2020 levels. Again, not a whole lot of detail on whether that was met or not. But that is how they're looking at evaluating performance shares and whether those vest is at least 20% based on those various carbon targets. On the next slide, we've got their performance award, that is their cash bonus program. That's also based on financial measures as well as ESG measures, and an individual factor that includes an ESG component. So as you'll see, we've got operating EBIT, we've got free cash flow, and then ESG metrics comprising 20% of their cash bonus program. In addition, we've got this individual factor that serves as a modifier to what was earned in those first 3 buckets, and that includes a safety component. So, the target amount is 100%, the max is 200%. On the next slide, let's talk about the specific, metrics that they used for ESG. So as part of that ESG bucket, they look at customer experience, sustainability, inclusion, and diversity. And those are, mostly objective and data-driven. For example, they're looking at, a WLO index on various things. They're also looking at, global representation of women and U.S. ethnic minority representation as a percentage of Dow's workforce. So they are using, some objective data in that regard, but again, not a whole lot of detail on exactly, what the targets were there and what was actually achieved. On the next slide, we do have, a little detail on their performance there. And you'll see on those various measures, they give us the percentages, required for threshold, target, and max. You'll see that on the ESG metrics, they were all achieved above target except for one, which was just slightly under. So the company performed very well with respect to these ESG metrics, and so the executives, got a good payout based on that.
Great. So next we're going to talk about some disclosure issues here. So as we just walked through several of those examples, you can kind of see it's all over the place in terms of what companies are or are not disclosing in this area. And so investors in the SEC have raised issues with the quality of ESG related disclosures. And so on this page, you can just see some specific quotes from various stakeholders here. But really, there's no SEC or stock exchange rules that necessarily mandate specific levels of ESG disclosures around compensation here. So the practice is all over the map, right, in terms of what companies are disclosing. And so there's been a lot of reaction about this, and I think this is one of those things we'll see obviously evolve, right? This is still fairly new in terms of how companies are going about this. So as this practice matures, I think we'll see a lot more standardization in this area. So what are some good practices as we kind of approach ESG metrics in your compensation plans? You'll see here just some questions to ask yourself, and you'll see a lot of this is very parallel to what we just walked through, right, in terms of how we structure the ESG metrics. Because really, at the end of the day, stakeholders, your shareholders really want to understand the logic behind why you chose those metrics, how you went about setting the goals, how are you going to measure those, what level of involvement did the board or committee have in terms of determining what these metrics look like. So with that in mind, just being sure that as you're just striving for this, to be mindful of the disclosures around kind of the narrative of how you went about ESG. But the other cautionary thing I'll say here, though, is And in some areas with the disclosure, just remember that kind of once the genie's out of the bottle, it's hard to put back in, right? So anytime you start disclosing something one year, think about, okay, well, what's that going to mean in future years as well, right? If you then all of a sudden start omitting something because it no longer looks as good or things like that. So just being very mindful long term about how you're going to go about disclosing your efforts around ESG and compensation.
Okay, so final thoughts on the ESG performance metrics. Don't overdo it except when it comes to disclosure. So avoid overcommitting on different ESG metrics. Create realistic goals over realistic timeframes. So as we mentioned at the beginning, a lot of companies, when they first start integrating ESG into their compensation programs, will choose to use a subjective measure or qualitative measure. That way, you're not sort of stuck in a bind if you have difficulty measuring ESG performance or gathering data. So really just try to take it slowly, and over time, as you get more experience, then you can start shifting into more objective quantitative metrics. And for disclosure, I think it used to be sufficient, as recent as just a few years ago, that companies could just say, we're committed to ESG, we've got an ESG metric in our bonus plan, and just put ESG in there somewhere, and that would suffice. And investors would read that and say, that's great, they're committed to ESG. Nowadays, investors, proxy advisory firms, regulators, all those parties we talked about earlier are taking a closer look at this, and that no longer suffices. So they are getting more savvy. They want better disclosure, more detail. They want to know what the goals are, what the targets were, how you did on them. So really, focus on your ESG-related disclosures. It's no longer just a check-the-box routine where you can expect to say ESG and just sort of get away with vague or incomplete disclosure. Okay, so next we're going to cover just a few other ESG considerations, not just related to ESG performance metrics and compensation. So first up, gender and racial pay equity. That falls under the ESG umbrella. A lot of companies are evaluating pay equity, and some have tied compensation to progress with respect to pay equity initiatives. So this has also been an area of big focus for state legislatures and government agencies who have moved to investigate a lot of pay equity compliance issues and enforce pay equity laws. Just to illustrate, all 50 states actually have some type of pay equity law on the books right now. I think the tight labor market, particularly since the pandemic, has impacted pay equity. I think a lot of companies have used that to sort of figure out through self-audits or claims raised by employees that there are pay equity issues within the company. For example, this could include things like wage compression, where more tenured workers end up getting less than new hires just due to the dynamics of the market and how things have shifted over time. There's also a greater push by investors and proxy advisory firms for companies to be more transparent about pay equity in their public filings and disclosures. With that in mind, it's important for companies to be aware of some potential issues. It's worth conducting a self-audit and implementing guidelines to help evaluate pay equity issues so you can stop them before they arise. Finally, we expect that the spotlight on pay equity will only continue to get brighter in the coming years. I want to give you one specific example. Illinois, back in 2021, proposed a law that would have taken effect next year where companies would have to certify compliance with pay equity laws, and if they failed to comply, they would be subject to a 1% fine based on their gross profits. So 1% of gross profits they would be fined if they didn't comply with pay equity. They had to walk that back. That penalty got a lot of flack in the press and from various companies, and so they changed it. The law is still in effect. They still are going to have to make that certification, and if they fail to comply, they will be fined, but the fine is now limited to $10,000. So that's a big step down. Nevertheless, lawmakers are very focused on this issue, and I wouldn't be surprised to see more states adopt laws like that in the future.
Great. So how do you practically go about analyzing pay equity? This is something that our group helps companies kind of navigate. And we usually start with an initial diagnostic, right? Looking at payroll data to determine if there's any irregularities based on gender, based on race, or there's other protected classes as well that a lot of companies evaluate to be sure that there's not some issue lurking under the surface. And so I should have said, I'm a CPA, I'm not an attorney, so I actually work very closely with Dario and his colleagues on this to be sure that anytime we're going through and crunching the numbers, that there's external legal counsel involved and then internal legal counsel involved as well, to the extent to the maximum extent possible, just to preserve any sort of attorney-client privilege as you go through this, because you might uncover something, right, that is not how it should be, and so protecting that so that you can go through the right steps to then correct that, but limiting legal exposure to the extent possible. So once you've kind of done the initial diagnostic, we then do dig kind of deeper into any of the issues that may have been surfaced as part of the initial diagnostic. Because I will say a lot of times whenever, maybe there's some red flags that are thrown up, but when you really dig in deeper, there might be a real reasonable explanation for why there's differences across gender or race or another protected class. And so it's important to kind of take another step or another deeper dive into those areas and figure out, is there a reasonable explanation here? And then moving on to corrective action. So to the extent there is still something that needs to be fixed, going through a very robust process about how to actually fix those and limit any sort of legal or financial exposure down the road. We always say, to do this as quickly as you possibly can, but also going through enough process to help protect yourself from any future exposure as well. So key consideration for pay audits, one, just gathering data. We try to gather as much as possible on the front end so that whenever you are going, a couple of layers deeper down, if there are some red flags that you find, that you already have that data with you so that you can kind of do some statistical analysis there and see if there's another reason for any sort of differences. So obviously job title, gender, race, education. The other thing I'll just highlight on here, I won't read the whole list, but in addition to base salary, we see a lot of companies focus on base salary, but bonus, that is an area where we see a lot of issues, also because it can be a little bit more subjective in terms of performance for employees, and also equity compensation. We've seen a lot of issues with, say, new hire grants, or there just might be a little bit more flexibility in who earns equity compensation, and so there could be pieces that where the pay equity issues actually are not in just your normal base salary, but some of those other components of compensation. The other thing I'll just highlight here is performance evaluations. I think that's an important thing to look at in terms of, it's very natural and appropriate to pay your higher performers, maybe more than mediocre, maybe those that are struggling, but also to be wary of the fact that there can be, unconscious bias in those performance evaluations as well. So to be sure to think about that holistically. In terms of timing, we always recommend starting as soon as you possibly can, and just try to, whatever you plan in terms of a time frame, tack on some extra few months, because it actually takes a lot longer than you would think in terms of getting through this process, because other things kind of come up along the way. You might realize that, okay, maybe we need to benchmark certain positions, maybe we're not paying market there, or it could be, our bands are out of whack or things like that. But also just to revisit this. This isn't one of those one and done type of analyses. It needs to be done on a regular basis because things change, right? Employees come and go. You might have, acquire a company. That's one thing we've seen a lot, is where a company may be in great shape, but they acquire another company and they have a different compensation philosophy and structure, and when you merge those two organizations together, that can cause a lot of issues if it's not addressed as soon as possible on the front end, and just issues can kind of creep up. But again, just being sure you give yourself runway because of the scope creep here, finally here. Again, the pay equity stuff, a lot of times it's kind of the first thing, but then you might uncover things underneath that need to be revised to where it might be showing that there's an issue when really there's not. There may be just kind of sloppy band structures or job descriptions, or one thing in the pandemic we saw a lot is, when after there'd be layoffs, there'd be somebody that's now wearing 3 different hats, right? And like, what role are they actually filling? And that can make it seem like somebody may be not being paid fairly, but they really are if you look at not just their job title, but the function they're actually fulfilling for the company.
Okay, so there are different types of pay equity. So we've got gender pay equity, racial pay equity, and also internal pay equity. And so that could refer to a couple of things. That could be the difference between the pay for an executive and the pay for a rank and file employee, or it could be the difference between the pay for 2 employees that are in the same position or have similar skills. On the executive to rank and file comparison, the SEC was interested in this topic when they added the CEO pay ratio disclosure requirement to public company proxy statements. As some of you that may have prepared that or reviewed that disclosure, there are some issues with the data that you can truly glean from it, and some companies do it better than others. But I think it did, shine a light on this issue, and you'll see, all the time news outlets picking up, various, ratios that are outrageous or really high. Without so much of a sophisticated understanding of what goes into those numbers, they just kind of see the ratio and report on that. But it did shine a light on how much the average CEO makes as compared to a median employee at a public company. As a result, in response to that, to sort of make the number look better, a lot of companies decided to start expanding their equity programs to include more rank and file employees in those grants. Or expand their incentive programs to pick up those individuals as well. That aids in retention, that incentivizes those individuals. It tells a good story, improves your pay ratio number. It has a lot of benefits, but obviously, it costs more money. It's more administratively difficult. If you give them equity, you run through your LTIP share reserve much quicker. So there are a lot of drawbacks, and so companies are kind of weighing what to do in that situation where you've got a ratio that's really, really big and bigger than you expected. Also, we've got this similar skill, similar position issue. That's often referred to as equal pay for equal work. Unless a company is conducting regular pay audits using some of the techniques that Allison just mentioned, it's easy to see how this issue could arise with a longtime employee who's been at the company for a long time and is sort of stuck in that same position. Then you bring on a new hire for the same position or a very similar role, and just due to the competitiveness of the market, as well as the hiring dynamics and how compensation has shifted, over the years since you hired that original employee, that new hire might be making a lot more, and that's not intentional, I think, on behalf of the company to have this pay equity disparity with that individual, but sometimes that's just what happens, and so that's still going to be an issue, even if it was not intentional or through no fault of the company. So that's why you should take the last slide to heart that Allison went over and really conduct these regular pay audits so you can figure out if those issues will arise or could arise or have already arisen, and you can take care of it. Okay, and that brings us to the end. So it looks like we've got maybe 4 minutes for some questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. And if not, that's okay too. We'll give you some time back. Yeah, of course.
Big picture on ESG. Do you have any personal thoughts on what's going to happen with the SEC draft rules and timing, and like any insight into what looks like may or may not end up being final?
Yeah, that's a great question, Allison. I'll see if you have any thoughts as well. But just kind of initially, the SEC is really focused on just a lot of rulemaking initiatives right now. We've seen that, right, with clawbacks and pay versus performance, and a lot of things that have sort of sat on the sidelines for a long time that they're pushing through. And so I expect that ESG is going to be one of those heightened areas of focus over the next couple of years at least, and they will really try to push that stuff through. Allison, any?
Yeah, no, I completely
thoughts?
agree. It's just things take longer than usual. I was thinking about some of the, we waited 12 years for some of the
exactly.
Dodd-Frank stuff, so it doesn't
Yeah.
move quickly. But I think there is a lot of external focus on this area where I think there'll be a lot of movement in the next several years.
Yeah.
Just a question on the objective metrics versus the subjective.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing more in the objective metrics, like task-oriented objective metrics, like you will take so much training this year, stuff that is task-oriented but not results-oriented? Or are you guys seeing more of a shift to outcomes and results?
Allison, thoughts?
Gosh, I'm seeing a little bit of both. I would say most of the time it's still focused on the outcome, not necessarily the steps that will get to that outcome. But usually because that's maybe a little bit easier to quantify. I think that's what I'm seeing a little bit more. But you're right, I do see some where it's more like the task of, like, for example, putting in some sort of policy or training program or some of those things that are a little bit more objective. I think it also depends on which letter you're kind of under, maybe under the governance, we see maybe a little bit more, like you said, objective tasks based on the front end versus maybe some of the like diversity stuff might be more kind of the outcome at the end kind of thing. Although I guess we do see training on that as well. Like for example, diversity inclusion training, unconscious bias training, things like that they want to have in place as a goal. But I don't know, Daria, if you have anything to add on that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think you see both. I do think primarily outcome-based, but you do see some task-based metrics, certainly. One of the Dow metrics we went over was, establish a plan for emissions reductions. And so it wasn't based on outcome, it was based on simply get this thing in place. And so that was, I think that comprised 1/3, of their ESG metric that year. And it looks like it related to their equity awards. So you certainly do see some of the task-based ones as well. Yeah.
I would think over time too, like at the beginning we might see a little bit more, like you were saying, the task-based, but as this gets more mature and it's already in place, it'll be shifting more probably to the outcome.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, well, I think that'll do it. Thank you all for joining us.
Great, thank you.